our application at the moment has one problem. When I open that modal sheet and I try to enter something here, you see that this gets cleared. The title gets cleared as soon as I click into the amount. If I click into the amount, into the title now, the amount gets cleared. So something's wrong here. By the way, of course, our amount is also a bit overlapped by the keyboard if we enter something into the title. And that's something we'll fix later. Also, if you would rotate the device into landscape, you wouldn't really be able to work with that. But let's take care about this later once we learn how to build more responsive user interfaces. For the moment, let's fix that issue of our data getting lost when we, well, click into the other fields. The fix is simple. You need to change new transaction, so this widget which renders these inputs, from a stateless into a stateful widget. Even though we're not calling setState in here, that internally changes something for Flutter, because the state object in the end is treated differently than a widget object. It's basically maintained and not rebuilt as often easily. And therefore, you should convert new transaction here to a stateful widget. And thanks to this refactoring syntax, that all is done automatically. And now if you reload your application with that saved, if you now open that again, now here we can enter something, and now the data is kept, and we can add this and see our new transaction here, which is of course pretty convenient. Now just to clarify and make it clear why we need to make this change to a stateful widget, it is related to what Flutter does internally. It reevaluates widgets from time to time, for example, if a parent widget changes, and I'll dive deeper into how Flutter evaluates your app and when something is reevaluated later in the course, no worries. But from time to time, Flutter does that. And for a stateless widget, a widget being reevaluated means that any internally stored data is reset, is lost. That's why we lose our user input in a stateless widget. Because whenever it is reevaluated by Flutter, for whatever reason, we lose the state that is currently stored in there. We lose our data that's stored in there. And for a stateful widget, that's different. There we have that separate state object, that state class. And whilst the widget there also would be reevaluated by Flutter, the state kind of is detached from this. And data stored in that state will not be lost if the widget that belongs to it is reevaluated by Flutter. So we have a separation of data and the UI, you could say, and therefore we can persist data, and it's not lost when something changes on the screen or when Flutter decides that it wants to reevaluate that widget. That's why our data is then persistent, and that's why we need a stateful widget here. Now internally here in new transaction, there's now also one important change. We still get add transaction as an argument here, and that's inside of our widget, right? Add transaction is a property in our widget, not in the state object, but in the widget. And it needs to be there because we need to define it, or we need to accept it on the constructor of the widget, not on the constructor of the state, because the state is constructed here with the help of createState, and that's inside of the widget. So to receive something, some data in the widget from outside, which is the case here, we receive a pointer at the add new transaction function, we need to accept it on the constructor of the widget. The problem is that I want to use this function from inside the state object thereafter, and not inside my widget, and these are two different classes technically. Thankfully, Flutter establishes a connection and gives us a special property inside of our state class. It gives us this widget property, and this refactoring step automatically added it. With widget dot, you can access the properties and methods of your widget class inside of your state class. So with widget dot add tx, I can access the addTX property, which is this function reference I get, even though I'm technically in a different class. That's important. Widget, that is a special property we haven't seen before. It has to be named widget, and it's only available in your state classes and gives you access to the connected widget. And with that, we now also fixed that issue of the bottom sheet clearing our inputs when we type in there. Now, another thing we can do is that when we enter a new transaction here, that we actually also close the bottom sheet as soon as we confirm it, and that we don't have to close it manually. And doing that is pretty straightforward. Here in submit data, after calling addTX, you can call navigator of context pop. Now that's something we haven't seen before. The navigator is also something I'll have a way closer look at in the navigation section of this course. It's built into Flutter and it can do a lot of awesome stuff. Here, we simply use its pop method to basically close the topmost screen that is displayed, and that is that modal sheet if it's opened. So that closes that modal sheet by popping it off, and more on that and what it does in detail in a later section. Off context here is required to get access to the right navigator or to give the navigator some metadata. And context here, just like widget, is a special property which is available class-wide in your state class here, even though you never defined a property named context. It's made available because we extend state. So it's basically like widget. It's a special property that is available and that in this case gives you access to the context of your widget. Widget gives you access to the class itself, to its properties and so on. Context gives you access to the context related to your widget. More on all of that later. With that, however, we now added the functionality that we can automatically close our bottom modal sheet once we're done. So if I now add my new shoes here, which let's say cost 99.99, now you see that also closes the modal sheet. With that, let's continue with our app and let's again turn our heads towards styling.